Good evening, and welcome to Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's installment provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep for once. So lie back, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath, and off we go. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few announcements that are typically at the end of the podcast, and which I hope many of you have been too asleep to hear up to now. If you're interested in learning more about the readings on this podcast, we do have a Goodreads account that includes a library of everything that's been read here. Just go to goodreads.com/boringbooksforbedtime. If you enjoy this podcast, it would be great if you'd leave a positive review on iTunes. It helps our visibility immensely. We also have a Patreon account with special perks for supporters. Just go to patreon.com and look up Boring Books for Bedtime. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, catch us on Twitter at BoringBooksPod. And now for tonight's book. We're reading The Poetics of Aristotle, translated with a critical text by S.H. Butcher, Doctor of Literature, LL.D., Professor of Greek in the University of Edinburgh, formerly Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge, and of University College, Oxford. Published by Macmillan & Co., London and New York, 1895. Let's begin. Aristotle's Poetics. Number 1. I propose to treat of poetry in itself and of its various kinds, noting the essential quality of each, to inquire into the structure of the plot as requisite to a good poem, into the number and nature of parts of which a poem is composed, and similarly into whatever else falls within the same inquiry. Following then the order of nature, let us begin with the principles which come first. Epic poetry and tragedy, comedy also, and dithyrambic, poetry and the music of the flute and of the lyre in most of their forms, are all in their general conception modes of imitation. They differ, however, from one another in 3 respects: the medium, the objects, the manner or mode of imitation, being in each case distinct. For as there are persons who, by conscious art or mere habit, imitate and represent various objects through the medium of color and form, or again by the voice, so in the arts above mentioned, taken as a whole, the imitation is produced by rhythm, language, or harmony, either singly or combined. Thus in the music of the flute and of the lyre, harmony and rhythm alone are employed. Also in other arts, such as that of the shepherd's pipe, which are essentially similar to these. In dancing, rhythm alone is used without harmony, for even dancing imitates character, emotion, and action by rhythmical movement. There is another art which imitates by means of language alone, and that either in prose or verse, which verse, again, may either combine different meters or consist of but one kind. But this has hitherto been without a name, for there is no common term we could apply to the mimes of Sophron and Xenarchus and the Socratic dialogues on the one hand, and on the other to poetic imitations in iambic, elegiac, or any similar meter. People do indeed add the word maker or poet to the name of the meter, and speak of elegiac poets, or epic, that is, hexameter poets, as if it were not the imitation that makes the poet, but the verse that entitles them all indiscriminately to the name. Even when a treatise on medicine or natural science is brought out in verse, the name of poet is by custom given to the author, and yet Homer and Empedocles have nothing in common but the meter, so that it would be right to call the one poet, the other physicist rather than poet. On the same principle, even if a writer in his poetic imitation were to combine all meters, as Chaeremon did in his Centaur, which is a medley composed of meters of all kinds, we should bring him too under the general term poet. So much then for these distinctions. There are again some arts which employ all the means above mentioned, namely rhythm, tune, and meter. Such are dithyrambic and gnomic poetry, and also tragedy and comedy. But between them the difference is that in the first two cases these means are all employed in combination. In the latter, now one means is employed, now another. Such then are the differences of the arts with respect to the medium of imitation. 2. Since the objects of imitation are men in action, and these men must be either of a higher or a lower type, for moral character mainly answers to these divisions, goodness and badness being the distinguishing marks of moral differences, it follows that we must represent men either as better than in real life, or as worse, or as they are. It is the same in painting. Polygnotus depicted men as nobler than they are, Pawson as less noble. Dionysius drew them true to life. Now it is evident that each of the modes of imitation above mentioned will exhibit these differences, and become a distinct kind of imitating objects that are thus distinct. Such diversities may be found even in dancing, flute playing, and lyre playing. So again in language, whether prose or verse unaccompanied by music. Homer, for example, makes men better than they are, Cleophon as they are, Hegemon the Thasian, the inventor of parodies, and Nicocares, the author of the Deliad, worse than they are. The same thing holds good of dithyrambs and nomes. Here too one may portray different types, as Timotheus and Philoxenus differed in representing their Cyclops. The same distinction marks off tragedy from comedy, for comedy aims at representing men as worse, tragedy as better than in actual life. 3. There is still a third difference, the manner in which each of these objects may be imitated. For the medium being the same, and the objects the same, the poet may imitate by narration, in which case he can either take another personality as Homer does, or speak in his own person unchanged, or he may present all his characters as living and moving before us. These then, as we said at the beginning, are the three differences which distinguish artistic imitation: the medium, the objects, and the manner. So that from one point of view, Sophocles is an imitator of the same kind as Homer, for both imitate higher types of character. From another point of view, of the same kind as Aristophanes, for both imitate persons acting and doing. Hence, some say, the name of drama is given to such poems as representing action. For the same reason, the Dorians claim the invention both of tragedy and comedy. The claim to comedy is put forward by the Megarians, not only by those of Greece proper, who allege that it originated under their democracy, but also by the Megarians of Sicily, for the poet Epicharmus, who is much earlier than Chionides and Magnes, belonged to that country. Tragedy, too, is claimed by certain Dorians of the Peloponnese. This may suffice as to the number and nature of the various modes of imitation. 4. Poetry in general seems to have sprung from two causes, each of them lying deep in our nature. First, the instinct of imitation is implanted in man from childhood. One difference between him and other animals being that he is the most imitative of living creatures, and through imitation learns his earliest lessons. And no less universal is the pleasure felt in things imitated. We have evidence of this in the facts of experience. Objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. The cause of this again is that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure, not only to philosophers, but to men in general, whose capacity, however, of learning is more limited. Thus the reason why men enjoy seeing a likeness is, that in contemplating it, they find themselves learning or inferring, and saying perhaps, "Ah, that is he." For if you happen not to have seen the original, the pleasure will be due not to the imitation as such, but to the execution, the coloring, or some other such cause. Imitation, then, is one instinct of our nature. Next, there is the instinct for harmony and rhythm, meters being manifestly sections of rhythm. Persons, therefore, starting with this natural gift, developed by degrees their special aptitudes, till their rude improvisations gave birth to poetry. Poetry now diverged in two directions according to the individual character of the writers. The graver spirits imitated noble actions, and the actions of good men. The more trivial sort imitated the actions of meaner persons, at first composing satires, as the former did hymns to the gods and the praises of famous men. A poem of the satirical kind cannot indeed be put down to any author earlier than Homer, though many such writers probably there were. But from Homer onward, instances can be cited, his own Margites, for example, and other similar compositions. The appropriate meter was also here introduced, hence the measure is still called the iambic or lampooning measure, being that in which people lampooned one another. Thus the older poets were distinguished as writers of heroic or of lampooning verse. As in the serious style, Homer is preeminent among poets, for he alone combined dramatic form with excellence of imitation. So he too first laid down the main lines of comedy, by dramatizing the ludicrous instead of writing personal satire. His Margites bears the same relation to comedy that the Iliad and Odyssey do to tragedy. But when tragedy and comedy came to light, the two classes of poets still followed their natural bent. The lampooners became writers of comedy, and the epic poets were succeeded by tragedians, since the drama was a larger and higher form of art. Whether tragedy has as yet perfected its proper types or not, and whether it is to be judged in itself or in relation also to the audience, this raises another question. Be that as it may, tragedy, as also comedy, was at first mere improvisation. The one originated with the authors of the dithyramb, the other with those of the phallic songs, which are still in use in many of our cities. Tragedy advanced by slow degrees. Each new element that showed itself was in turn developed. Having passed through many changes, it found its natural form, and there it stopped. Aeschylus first introduced a second actor. He diminished the importance of the chorus and assigned the leading part to the dialogue. Sophocles raised the number of actors to 3 and added scene painting. Moreover, It was not till late that the short plot was discarded for one of greater compass, and the grotesque diction of the earlier satiric form for the stately manner of tragedy. The iambic measure then replaced the trochaic tetrameter, which was originally employed when the poetry was of the satiric order and had greater affinities with dancing. Once dialogue had come in, nature herself discovered the appropriate measure, for the iambic is, of all measures, the most colloquial. We see it in the fact that conversational speech runs into iambic lines more frequently than in any other kind of verse, rarely into hexameters, and only when we drop the colloquial intonation. The additions to the number of episodes or acts, and the other accessories of which tradition tells, must be taken as already described, for to discuss them in detail would, doubtless, be a large undertaking. 5. Comedy is, as we have said, an imitation of characters of a lower type, not, however, in the full sense of the word bad, the ludicrous being merely a subdivision of the ugly. It consists in some defect or ugliness which is not painful or destructive. To take an obvious example, the comic mask is ugly and distorted, but does not imply pain. The successive changes through which tragedy passed, and the authors of these changes are well known, whereas comedy has had no history, because it was not at first treated seriously. It was late before the Archon granted a comic chorus to a poet. The performers were, till then, voluntary. Comedy had already taken definite shape when comic poets, distinctively so called, are heard of. Who furnished it with masks, or prologues, or increased the number of actors? These and other similar details remain unknown. As for the plot, it came originally from Sicily, but of Athenian writers, Crates was the first who, abandoning the iambic or lampooning form, generalized his themes and plots. Epic poetry agrees with tragedy insofar as it is an imitation in verse of characters of a higher type. They differ in that epic poetry admits but one kind of meter, and is narrative in form. They differ again in their length, for tragedy endeavors, as far as possible, to confine itself to a single revolution of the sun, or but slightly to exceed this limit, whereas the epic action has no limits of time. This, then, is a second point of difference, though at first the same freedom was admitted in tragedy as in epic poetry. Of their constituent parts, some are common to both, some peculiar to tragedy. Whoever therefore knows what is good or bad tragedy knows also about epic poetry. All the elements of an epic poem are found in tragedy, but the elements of a tragedy are not all found in the epic poem. 6. Of the poetry which imitates in hexameter verse, and of comedy we will speak hereafter. Let us now discuss tragedy, resuming its formal definition, as resulting from what has been already said. Tragedy, then, is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. By language embellished, I mean language into which rhythm, harmony, and song enter. By the several kinds in separate parts, I mean that some parts are rendered through the medium of verse alone, others again with the aid of song. Now, as tragic imitation implies persons acting, it necessarily follows in the first place that spectacular equipment will be a part of tragedy. Next, song and diction, for these are the medium of imitation. By diction, I mean the mere metrical arrangement of the words. As for song, it is a term whose sense everyone understands. Again, tragedy is the imitation of an action, and an action implies personal agents who necessarily possess certain distinctive qualities both of character and thought. For it is by these that we qualify actions themselves, and these, thought and character, are the two natural causes from which actions spring, and on actions again all success or failure depends. Hence, the plot is the imitation of the action, for by plot I here mean the arrangement of the incidents. By character, I mean that in virtue of which we ascribe certain qualities to the agents. Thought is required wherever a statement is proved, or, it may be, a general truth enunciated. Every tragedy, therefore, must have 6 parts, which parts determine its quality, namely plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, song. 2 of the parts constitute the medium of imitation, 1 the manner, and 3 the objects of imitation, and these complete the list. These elements have been employed, we may say, by the poets to a man. In fact, every play contains spectacular elements, as well as character, plot, diction, song, and thought. But most important of all is the structure of the incidents. For tragedy is an imitation, not of men, but of an action and of life, and life consists in action, and its end is a mode of action, not a quality. Now, character determines men's qualities, but it is by their actions that they are happy or the reverse. Dramatic action, therefore, is not with a view to the representation of character. Character comes in as subsidiary to the actions. Hence the incidents and the plot are the end of a tragedy, and the end is the chief thing of all. Again, without action, there cannot be a tragedy. There may be without character. The tragedies of most of our modern poets fail in the rendering of character, and of poets in general this is often true. It is the same in painting, and here lies the difference between Zeuxis and Polygnotus. Polygnotus delineates character well. The style of Zeuxis is devoid of ethical quality. Again, if you string together a set of speeches expressive of character and well finished in point of diction and thought, you will not produce the essential tragic effect nearly so well as with a play which, however deficient in these respects, yet has a plot and artistically constructed incidents. Besides which, the most powerful elements of emotional interest in tragedy, peripetia or reversal of the situation, and recognition scenes are parts of the plot. A further proof is that novices in the art attain to finish of diction and precision of portraiture before they can construct the plot. It is the same with almost all the early poets. The plot, then, is the first principle, and as it were, the soul of a tragedy. Character holds the second place. A similar fact is seen in painting. The most beautiful colors, laid on confusedly, will not give as much pleasure as the chalk outline of a portrait. Thus tragedy is the imitation of an action, and of the agents mainly with a view to the action. Third in order is thought, that is, the faculty of saying what is possible and pertinent in given circumstances. In the case of oratory, this is the function of the political art and of the art of rhetoric, and so indeed the older poets make their characters speak the language of civic life, the poets of our time the language of the rhetoricians. Character is that which reveals moral purpose, showing what kind of things a man chooses or avoids. Speeches, therefore, which do not make this manifest, or in which the speaker does not choose or avoid anything whatever, are not expressive of character. Thought, on the other hand, is found where something is proved to be or not to be, or a general maxim is enunciated. Fourth among the elements enumerated comes diction, by which I mean, as has already been said, the expression of the meaning in words, and its essence is the same both in verse and prose. Of the remaining elements, song holds the chief place among the embellishments. The spectacle has, indeed, an emotional attraction of its own, but of all the parts, it is the least artistic, and connected least with the art of poetry. For the power of tragedy, we may be sure, is felt even apart from representation and actors. Besides, the production of spectacular effects depends more on the art of the stage machinist than on that of the poet. 7. These principles being established, let us now discuss the proper structure of the plot, since this is the first and most important thing in tragedy. Now, according to our definition, tragedy is an imitation of an action that is complete and whole and of a certain magnitude, for there may be a whole that is wanting in magnitude. A whole is that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A beginning is that which does not itself follow anything by causal necessity, but after which something naturally is or comes to be. An end, on the contrary, is that which itself naturally follows some other thing, either by necessity or as a rule, but has nothing following it. A middle is that which follows something as some other thing follows it. A well-constructed plot, therefore, must neither begin nor end at haphazard, but conform to these principles. Again, a beautiful object, whether it be a living organism or any whole composed of parts, must not only have an orderly arrangement of parts, but must also be of a certain magnitude, for beauty depends on magnitude and order. Hence, a very small animal organism cannot be beautiful, for the view of it is confused, the object being seen in an almost imperceptible moment of time. Nor again can one of vast size be beautiful, for as the eye cannot take it all in at once, the unity and sense of the whole is lost for the spectator. As for instance, if there were one 1,000 miles long. As therefore in the case of animate bodies and organisms, a certain magnitude is necessary, and a magnitude which may be easily embraced in one view, so in the plot a certain length is necessary, and a length which can be easily embraced by the memory. The limit of length in relation to dramatic competition and sensuous presentment is no part of artistic theory, for had it been the rule for 100 tragedies to compete together, the performance would have been regulated by the water clock, as indeed we are told was formerly done. But the limit as fixed by the nature of the drama itself is this: the greater the length, the more beautiful will the piece be by reason of its size, provided that the whole be perspicuous. And to define the matter roughly, we may say that the proper magnitude is comprised within such limits, that the sequence of events, according to the law of probability or necessity, will admit of a change from bad fortune to good, or from good fortune to bad. 8. Unity of plot does not, as some persons think, consist in the unity of the hero, for infinitely various are the incidents in one man's life which cannot be reduced to unity, and so too there are many actions of one man out of which we cannot make one action. Hence the error, as it appears, of all poets who have composed a Heracleid, a Theseid, or other poems of the kind. They imagine that as Heracles was one man, the story of Heracles must also be a unity. But Homer, as in all else he is of surpassing merit, here too, whether from art or natural genius, seems to have happily discerned the truth. In composing the Odyssey, he did not include all the adventures of Odysseus, such as his wound on Parnassus, or his feigned madness at the mustering of the host, incidents between which there was no necessary or probable connection. But he made the Odyssey, and likewise the Iliad, to center round an action that in our sense of the word is one. As therefore in the other imitative arts, the imitation is one when the object imitated is one, so the plot, being an imitation of an action, must imitate one action, and that a whole, the structural union of the parts being such that, if any one of them is displaced or removed, the whole will be disjointed and disturbed. For a thing whose presence or absence makes no visible difference is not an organic part of the whole. 9. It is moreover evident from what has been said that it is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. The poet and the historian differ not by writing in verse or in prose. The work of Herodotus might be put into verse, and it would still be a species of history, with meter no less than without it. The true difference is that one relates what has happened, the other what may happen. Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, for poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular. By the universal, I mean how a person of a certain type will on occasion speak or act according to the law of probability or necessity. And it is this universality at which poetry aims in the names she attaches to the personages. The particular is, for example, what Alcibiades did or suffered. In comedy this is already apparent, for here the poet first constructs the plot on the lines of probability, and then inserts characteristic names, unlike the lampooners who write about particular individuals. But tragedians still keep to real names, the reason being that what is possible is credible. What has not happened we do not at once feel sure to be possible, but what has happened is manifestly possible. Otherwise it would not have happened. Still, there are even some tragedies in which there are only one or two well-known names, the rest being fictitious. In others, none are well known, as in Agathon's Antheus, where incidents and names alike are fictitious, and yet they give none the less pleasure. We must not, therefore, at all costs keep to the received legends, which are the usual subjects of tragedy. Indeed, it would be absurd to attempt it, for even subjects that are known only to a few, and yet give pleasure to all. It clearly follows that the poet or maker should be the maker of plots rather than of verses, since he is a poet because he imitates, and what he imitates are actions. and even if he chances to take an historical subject, he is nonetheless a poet, for there is no reason why some events that have actually happened should not conform to the law of the probable and possible, and in virtue of that quality in them, he is their poet or maker. Of all plots and actions, the episodic are the worst. I call a plot episodic in which the episodes or acts succeed one another without probable or necessary sequence. Bad poets compose such pieces by their own fault, good poets to please the players. For as they write show pieces for competition, they stretch the plot beyond its capacity and are often forced to break the natural continuity. But again, tragedy is an imitation not only of a complete action, but of events inspiring fear or pity. Such an effect is best produced when the events come on us by surprise, and the effect is heightened when, at the same time, they follow as cause and effect. The tragic wonder will then be greater than if they happened of themselves or by accident. For even coincidences are most striking when they have an air of design. We may instance the statue of Mitis at Argos, which fell upon his murderer while he was a spectator at a festival and killed him. Such events seem not to be due to mere chance. Plots, therefore, constructed on these principles are necessarily the best. 10. Plots are either simple or complex, for the actions in real life, of which the plots are an imitation, obviously show a similar distinction. An action which is one and continuous in the sense above defined, I call simple, when the change of fortune takes place without reversal of the situation and without recognition. A complex action is one in which the change is accompanied by such reversal or by recognition or by both. These last should arise from the internal structure of the plot, so that what follows should be the necessary or probable result of the preceding action. It makes all the difference whether any given event is a case of propter hoc or post hoc. 11. Reversal of the situation is a change by which the action veers round to its opposite, subject always to our rule of probability or necessity. Thus, in the Oedipus, the messenger comes to cheer Oedipus and free him from his alarms about his mother, but by revealing who he is, he produces the opposite effect. Again, in the Lynceus is being led away to his death, and Danaus goes with him, meaning to slay him, but the outcome of the preceding incidents is that Danaus is killed and Lynceus saved. Recognition, as the name indicates, is a change from ignorance to knowledge, producing love or hate between the persons destined by the poet for good or bad fortune. The best form of recognition is coincident with the reversal of the situation, as in the Oedipus. There are indeed other forms. Even inanimate things of the most trivial kind may in a sense be objects of recognition. Again, we may recognize or discover whether a person has done a thing or not. But the recognition which is most intimately connected with the plot and action is, as we have said, the recognition of persons. This recognition, combined with reversal, will produce either pity or fear, and actions producing these effects are those which, by our definition, tragedy represents. Moreover, it is upon such situations that the issues of good or bad fortune will depend. Recognition, then, being between persons, it may happen that one person only is recognized by the other when the latter is already known, or it may be necessary that the recognition should be on both sides. Thus, Iphigenia is revealed to Orestes by the sending of the letter, but another act of recognition is required to make Orestes known to Iphigenia. Two parts then of the plot, reversal of the situation and recognition, turn upon surprises. A third part is the scene of suffering. The scene of suffering is a destructive or painful action, such as death on the stage, bodily agony, wounds, and the like. 12. The parts of tragedy which must be treated as elements of the whole have been already mentioned. We now come to the quantitative parts, and the separate parts into which tragedy is divided, namely prologue, episode, exode, choric song, this last being divided into parode and stasimon. These are common to all plays. Peculiar to some are the songs of actors from the stage and the komoi. The prologue is that entire part of the tragedy which precedes the parode of the chorus. The episode is the entire part of a tragedy which is between complete choric songs. The exode is that entire part of a tragedy which has no choric song after it. Of the choric part, the parode is the first undivided utterance of the chorus. The stasimon is a choric ode without anapaests or trochaic tetrameters. The komos is a joint lamentation of chorus and actors. The parts of tragedy which must be treated as elements of the whole have already been mentioned. The quantitative parts, the separate parts into which it is divided, are here enumerated. 13. As the sequel to what has already been said, we must proceed to consider what the poet should aim at and what he should avoid in constructing his plots, and by what means the specific effect of tragedy will be produced. A perfect tragedy should, as we have seen, be arranged not on the simple but on the complex plan. It should, moreover, imitate actions which excite pity and fear, this being the distinctive mark of tragic imitation. It follows plainly in the first place that the change of fortune presented must not be the spectacle of a virtuous man brought from prosperity to adversity, for this moves neither pity nor fear. It merely shocks us. Nor again that of a bad man passing from adversity to prosperity, for nothing can be more alien to the spirit of tragedy. It possesses no single tragic quality. It neither satisfies the moral sense, nor calls forth pity or fear. Nor again should the downfall of the utter villain be exhibited. A plot of this kind would, doubtless, satisfy the moral sense, but it would inspire neither pity nor fear, for pity is aroused by unmerited misfortune, fear by the misfortune of a man like ourselves. Such an event, therefore, will be neither pitiful nor terrible. There remains, then, the character between these two extremes, that of a man who is not eminently good and just, yet whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity, but by some error or frailty. He must be one who is highly renowned and prosperous, a personage like Oedipus, Thyestes, or other illustrious men of such families. A well-constructed plot should, therefore, be single in its issue rather than double, as some maintain. The change of fortune should be not from bad to good, but reversely, from good to bad. It should come about as the result not of vice, but of some great error or frailty in a character either such as we have described, or better rather than worse. The practice of the stage bears out our view. At first, the poets recounted any legend that came in their way. Now, the best tragedies are founded on the story of a few houses, on the fortunes of Alcmaeon, Oedipus, Orestes, Meleager, Thyestes, Telephus, and those others who have done or suffered something terrible. A tragedy, then, to be perfect according to the rules of art, should be of this construction. Hence they are in error who censure Euripides just because he follows this principle in his plays, many of which end unhappily. It is, as we have said, the right ending. The best proof is that on the stage and in dramatic competition, such plays, if well worked out, are the most tragic in effect. And Euripides, faulty though he may be in the general management of his subject, yet is felt to be the most tragic of the poets. In the second rank comes the kind of tragedy which some place first. Like the Odyssey, it has a double thread of plot, and also an opposite catastrophe for the good and for the bad. It is accounted the best because of the weakness of the spectators, for the poet is guided in what he writes by the wishes of his audience. The pleasure, however, thence derived is not the true tragic pleasure. It is proper rather to comedy, where those who in the piece are the deadliest enemies, like Orestes and Aegisthus, quit the stage as friends at the close, and no one slays or is slain. 14. Fear and pity may be aroused by spectacular means, but they may also result from the inner structure of the piece, which is the better way, and indicates a superior poet. For the plot ought to be so constructed that, even without the aid of the eye, he who hears the tale told will thrill with horror and melt to pity at what takes place. This is the impression we should receive from hearing the story of the Oedipus. But to produce this effect by the mere spectacle is a less artistic method, and dependent on extraneous aids. Those who employ spectacular means to create a sense not of the terrible, but only of the monstrous, are strangers to the purpose of tragedy. For we must not demand of tragedy any and every kind of pleasure, but only that which is proper to it. And since the pleasure which the poet should afford is that which comes from pity and fear through imitation, it is evident that this quality must be impressed upon the incidents. Let us then determine what are the circumstances which strike us as terrible or pitiful. Actions capable of this effect must happen between persons who are either friends or enemies or indifferent to one another. If an enemy kills an enemy, there is nothing to excite pity either in the act or the intention, except so far as the suffering in itself is pitiful. So again with indifferent persons. But when the tragic incident occurs between those who are near or dear to one another, if, for example, a brother kills or intends to kill a brother, a son his father, a mother her son, a son his mother, or any other deed of the kind is done, these are the situations to be looked for by the poet. He may not indeed destroy the framework of the received legends. The fact, for instance, that Clytemnestra was slain by Orestes, and Eriphyle by Alcmaeon, but he ought to show invention of his own, and skillfully handle the traditional material. Let us explain more clearly what is meant by skillful handling. The action may be done consciously and with knowledge of the persons, in the manner of the older poets. It is thus, too, that Euripides makes Medea slay her children. Or again, the deed of horror may be done, but done in ignorance, and the tie of kinship or friendship be discovered afterwards. The Oedipus of Sophocles is an example. Here, indeed, the incident is outside the drama proper, but cases occur where it falls within the action of the play. One may cite the Alcmaeon of Astydamas, or Telegonus in the Wounded Odysseus. Again, there is a third case, to be about to act with knowledge of the persons and then not to act. The fourth case is when someone is about to do an irreparable deed through ignorance, and makes the discovery before it is done. These are the only possible ways, for the deed must either be done or not done, and that wittingly or unwittingly. But of all these ways, to be about to act, knowing the persons, and then not to act, is the worst. It is shocking without being tragic, for no disaster follows. It is therefore never or very rarely found in poetry. One instance, however, is in the Antigone, where Haman threatens to kill Creon. The next and better way is that the deed should be perpetrated. Still better, that it should be perpetrated in ignorance, and the discovery made afterwards. There is then nothing to shock us, while the discovery produces a startling effect. The last case is the best, as when in the Cresphontes, Merope is about to slay her son, but recognizing who he is, spares his life. So in the Iphigenia, the sister recognizes the brother just in time. Again in the Hele, the son recognizes the mother when on the point of giving her up. This, then, is why a few families only, as has been already observed, furnish the subjects of tragedy. It was not art, but happy chance, that led the poets in search of subjects to impress the tragic quality upon their plots. They are compelled, therefore, to have recourse to those houses whose history contains moving incidents like these. Enough has now been said concerning the structure of the incidents and the right kind of plot. And with that, I think we'll end our reading of the Poetics of Aristotle. How funny that in 2,000 years so little has changed. Hopefully you're no longer awake to hear this, but if you are, and you need something else to do besides think about that novel you haven't written yet, we'd love to hear from you on Twitter at BoringBooksPod. Let us know what you think of the podcast, and if you have some suggestions for readings. We're always looking for something new and old. Thank you so much for listening. Until our next boring book, good night.